Okay, so in this crops class, we're talking about chrysanthemum production. Um, Chrysanthemums are found everywhere. It's one of the most common cut flowers and potted plants. I mean, just think of fall mums, or if you go to the grocery store, you look at your typical potted plant, it's going to be a pot mum, as we call it. Just because they're common doesn't mean they don't have their tricks and nuances to grow. And also they are still very much a profitable crop. So let's dig into it. So it's grown both as a potted crop, right? So that's, in a pot, as a weekly, we call it, or as a fall mum, like large pots growing outside, huge, usually like hundreds of flowers on them, or as cut mums. It's probably one of the most common and least expensive cut flowers you can put in a bouquet. So a lot of times they're used as filler. They have good shelf life, they have good color, they're very striking. So it's still a very significant industry. Um, Going back in the history of it, it's actually originally from China. They've been grown for over 2,000 years, at least that we know of. And again, with the craziness of wooden boats going everywhere collecting stuff in the 1800s, we brought chrysanthemums back to Europe, and they began to play and tinker with them, creating hybrids and perennial and annual types. And then by the time we hit the 1940s, this is right around World War II, so it's always kind of weird to think that normal everyday stuff was still going on during World War II, but believe it or not, it was. Uh, so they started breeding it pretty seriously, especially in Holland, and it's still bred to this day. They come up with unusual flower shapes and colors and sizes. I've just picked a few here. If you go to delaflor.nl, you'll see hundreds of varieties that are bred and grown. So for a potted plant, we're looking for a well-branched variety, right? Because each branch is going to terminate with a flower. So the more branches, the more flowers. But we also need to breed it such that the branches can support the flowers. Oftentimes with fall mums, we go so extreme on the flower count that the weight of the flowers can't be supported by the branch, and they snap off when you go to pick the plant up. Uh, we often breed in mildew resistance. Mildew is something that is a continual challenge with chrysanthemums, and so we try to build resistance genetically into the plants. And of course, they're always breeding for lots of different colors. As a cut flower, we're looking for really, really good flowering characteristics. We don't care so much about the stem because we're going to shape that thing. We want good color that doesn't fade, and good shapes. And then, of course, flower life is important. As far as growing, let's talk about producing a pot plant first. Then we'll discuss a cut plant, and then we'll go into some of the diseases and whatnot. But so for a potted plant, or potted chrysanthemum, particularly a fall mum, right? That's sort of in Ontario, the biggest, most common industry. We typically stick our cuttings in June. It's quite early, we're talking fall. It's a fairly long crop. You can use a simple #1 rooting compound. It's a vegetative cutting. It doesn't need a lot of hormone. Fairly warm temperatures, 21 to 22 degrees Celsius with high humidity. This is where tenting is often done. With mums. Stick the cuttings on a bench, put a dome over it, cover with a plastic layer to keep the humidity in, and a week or two later, it's done. This link, if you go to your PowerPoint version of this lesson, that link is active. I suggest you look at it. I've got a bunch of other videos that are really interesting to watch. You should see how sophisticated mum production has become with robotics and using intelligent imaging and automatic transplanting. It's wild, but big business. So some growers in weekly programs actually stick the cuttings directly in a pot. If you're going a 4-inch, 5 or 6-inch pot, they would just usually stick the cuttings directly into the end pot. And even with pot mums or fall mums with larger pots, they sometimes direct stick. It depends on the variety. and your space, what you have to root it out, right? Can you properly root that many pots, or is it easier to do plugs and then transplant? So it depends on your facility. But direct sticking is definitely done, with smaller weekly pots. When we talk about weekly, we're talking about those grocery store pots with your standard pot cover, your $3.99 or $4.99 potted flower thing you see at your any old grocery store. Uh, Typically, after a transplant and they've grown for 2 to 3 weeks, the plants have established. At that point, we pinch. All right. So in this picture, you'll see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 apical meristems. 5 cuttings have gone into that 6-inch pot. And here the person's grabbing the apical and pinching it off. So it's removed. And why do we do that? Because we get way more lateral branches and more flowers. It gets bushier and produces more flowers. So, for your 5 cuttings, instead of terminating at 5 flowers, they would produce maybe 15 flowers because each stem would then have, say, 3 flowers. So pinching is critical with chrysanthemums. And it is, for the most part, done by hand, unlike hydrangeas where they just mow it, because the harsh cutting of a leaf, like maybe not perfectly off, like cutting a leaf in half, it doesn't matter, because with the hydrangea, you're going to put that plant into the cooler and knock all the leaves off because you want it to branch in the field before you bulk it up. Whereas with the mum, there is no winter treatment. There's no vernalization. We're pinching and then we're selling. So we can't just, mow it with a lawnmower, even though that would work. But all the leaves that got cut harshly would be ugly and might invite disease or pests. And here you can see the part they've pinched off the pot, leaving the apical meristems have been removed, right? And when you remove an apical meristem, we remove apical dominance. And so with this gone, all the lateral branches start to grow. So each one that you take off, lateral branches form, and they always terminate with a flower. So here you got a flower, and you got a flower, and you got a flower, and you got a flower. Instead of 2, we have 4. So pinching is really critical. Now, as far as pinching goes, there is, in recent years, geneticists have bred into, especially fall mum varieties, because there's so many and there's so many branches. They have bred in what's called automatic self-pinching. And what happens essentially is that the terminal bud on each stem is programmed to abort. So the fall mum grows, and then the apical meristems self-abort, and then they break that apical dominance. So that's a pretty fantastic labor-saving feature that fall mums have produced, and they're so efficient at self-aborting that fall mums like this, they just turn into a giant, hugely branched with hundreds of flowers. I mean, it's astonishing how well it works. So as far as the scheduling goes, there's 8 and 15-week type mums. 8 weeks from transplant to sale date. Most growers grow the longer ones, especially for fall mums. With your weekly program, you might go more with the 8 weeks variety to keep things turning. But most people in the fall one use the longer varieties. And one thing that's especially unique about chrysanthemums is that they are a short day flowering plant. That's originally how they turned into a fall mum, right? Because it was inexpensive to grow, but you could only get it to flower in the fall if you didn't have equipment. So remember, a short day flowering plant needs what to flower? It's always opposite. So if it's a short day, it needs a long night, right? So a short day means it needs a long night. And remember, the plant measures the night, not the day. Oftentimes we get confused by that. The plant measures the night length, not the day length. So a short day chrysanthemum, and you look at this picture, this is the night component. It's dark. This, we get flower forming. If the day is longer, then we get just vegetative growth. Right? Now, one other trick, which is used in chrysanthemum production a lot, is that let's say you're in the middle of the winter, but you don't really want it to flower. Not yet. All you do is turn a light on in the middle of the night. And what that does is it splits the night. So obviously you put the light on in the middle of the night, and that means that you've got a short night here and you've got a short night here. So you've got two short nights. And what does the plant see? It only ever sees a short night. This light in the middle of the night disrupts it. So it sees a short night no matter what we do, which means it's going to stay vegetative. And remember that, because that's really important for different ways of growing chrysanthemums that we'll talk about in a minute. So for fall production, right, natural lighting is sufficient because the days are getting shorter and the nights are getting longer. But if you're doing weekly sales, pot mum sales, right, every week of the year, what are you going to do in the summer? You have long summer days. What are you going to do? So you use blackout, and you black out your greenhouse. Now that can get real tricky if it's hot, right? So obviously that happens at the end of the day, but heat is a challenge for greenhouses producing in the summer. Fortunately, sales for potted mums are not very strong in the summer, so some farms, quite a few, just sort of stop through the summer, and then they pick up again in the fall. And there's a period of time where they don't really need night interruption because the nights are long. And then when they get towards spring, they start using blackout, and it's not as hot, so it works. And then when they get to summer again, they sort of pack it in. So typically a mum needs 12 to 15 hours of darkness in order to flower. So that's where your blackout comes in. And once say you've grown your plant, it's vegetatively been growing, you need about 4 weeks of blackout to set buds, to get flowers to start. So a 10-week mum, remember there was 8 week to 15 weeks, so a 10-week mum, you would initiate short days after 6 weeks of growth from transplant. So I'm not going to get into detailed scheduling because there's so many varieties and so many different strategies. So that kind of stuff is on your grower data sheet that you'd look at when you buy a particular variety. But you need 4 weeks of blackout, so remember that, in order to set buds. If buds were to appear prematurely for some reason, right, something went wrong, you can actually remove the buds and then actually feed extra nitrogen, which would steer the mum towards vegetative growth. You can kind of push it back into vegetative growth and buy yourself a little more time if it somehow started flowering early. So typically night interruption is used even if your nights are long. It's sort of like insurance. They may run the lights depending on the time of year for anywhere from, half an hour to 4 hours. But usually they're running it for a couple hours at minimum. And you don't need a lot, about 20 micromoles, right? So here, a string light is literally all you need. We're not growing the plant. We're not running photosynthesis. All we're doing is messing up its hormones so that it perceives that the night has ended. Okay, this graph is showing us how the day length throughout the calendar year for our area. And obviously, December, January are the shortest days of the year. So as far as your night interruption, if you're anywhere from October to March, so through the dead of winter, we use about 4 hours of night interruption if we're trying to maintain a vegetative state. April to May, you can use about 3 hours of night interruption. And then through the summer, 3 hours. Getting into the dead middle of summer, June, July, you only need about 2 hours. So it ranges from 2 to 4 hours of night interruption to keep the chrysanthemum vegetative. Okay. Now, of course, November to February, you don't need night interruption if you're trying to flower, right? So if it's 12 to 15 hours are needed, why do fall mums initiate flowers in the field in the fall? So remember, this is a field production. There's no greenhouse, there's no blackout blocking the sunlight, and yet chrysanthemums still kind of set bud and flower in the fall, right? They don't have 12 hours of darkness in October. So there's something else going on, right? What's going on is that chrysanthemums are actually thermomorphic. We've learned that already in another lesson. So on top of being photoperiodic, where we use night interruption to guarantee that it won't set bud, if we're trying to encourage vegetative growth, they will naturally start to flower as the day lengths are shortening. But the big thing is that your night temperatures start dropping around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. That's fairly cool. That's why they're called fall mums, right? So when the fall comes and nights are cooler, that actually has a bigger influence in photoperiod in terms of setting flowers. So you only need a few days of cold, right? So if you had a weird cold front come in, your mums would actually trigger flowering early. So what are the growing needs for chrysanthemums? Like many things, never let them dry out. Now, some plants can handle it, but chrysanthemums do not. They drink a lot of water. If you're growing potted mums in the field, they get watered every day, quite a few times a day. They drink a lot. If you let them dry out, they'll flower earlier from stress, which is common, but you'll get less branching. So it'll be a thinner, stretched out plant. Undesirable. A mature 10 inches, 10 inches sort of your typical fall mum, can consume up to 2 liters of water per day. That's a lot per plant. Just think about that. A couple of bags of milk worth of water going in there every day, each pot. You need a lot of water. Feeding every 5 days. So it's not every day. You don't feed every day. Your salt levels will go through the roof in the root zone. But every 5th day, we're going to feed 250 ppm nitrogen. Remember, we always look, as growers, we look at the ppm or the millimole nitrogen requirements. That means that the other nutrients follow according to the ratio of the fertilizer that's recommended. So if it's 250 ppm nitrogen, that means we're asking for 250 ppm potassium because it's the same. But we're going to ask for 125 ppm phosphorus because it's half the percentage. So that's sort of a typical chrysanthemum feed, 20-10-20. Calcium is critical. A lot of growers go with a Cal Mag special mix, which has calcium magnesium added. Not all the time though. If you don't have enough calcium, your branches are weak and the branches will snap, especially when the flowers get wet when it rains or wind blows on your outdoor crop. The branches will stress and snap off because of all the weight. So typically a calcium nitrate shot is rotated in with your 20-10-20. Just straight calcium nitrate. That gives the shot a shot of calcium for those mums to have a strong stem. pH is normal for a potted crop. Remember, this is not hydroponics. This is potted stuff. Typically a higher pH in the root zone. So a 6 to 6.5. As far as the media goes, one interesting thing about chrysanthemums is that they are almost always grown in a peat mix that has compost, which is really interesting. Not many potted plants use that. I like it, but not many growers use it because they're worried about, fungal infection or holding too much water. But 20 to 25% compost gives extra nutrients. It improves moisture retention. Remember, mums need a lot of water. Plus, you get some minor nutrients, right? Like micronutrients and even nitrogen coming from the compost. There's also benefit from bacterial populations in there that would, help break down nutrients and make them available to the plants, and also a beneficial fungi. So it's a common thing to have a compost mix. Most media growers supply what's called a mum mix, which has that compost in it. It also has a higher cation exchange capacity, which means that your nutrients don't leach out as much. And remember, you're doing a lot of irrigating and you're growing out in the field and it might pour rain in a rainstorm one day. You don't want all your nutrients to leach out of the soil, so that compost helps hold on to the nutrients you've given it. So there's a bunch of pluses. Plus, you have extended shelf life when you send it to the store because the compost holds on to nutrients. They're all win-win-wins, right? Controlled release fertilizer is something that is commonly used with mums. This is a kind of nutrient that is inside a coating. Now, there's two different things. There's prilled fertilizers and there's controlled release fertilizers. You should know the difference. A prilled fertilizer is like a pelletized fertilizer, like coarse salt. It doesn't have a coating. It's just in chunks, which means that it takes a little longer to dissolve. Whereas controlled release fertilizer is fertilizer that's sort of in chunks, but then it's coated with a biodegradable film. and that film helps control the release of the nutrients. Um, Typically, the way it works is that uh, you mix it into your media. You can put it on top. There's a risk that it will fall off if the plant rolls over. Sometimes you can incorporate it into the media when you mix it, but often it's just placed on top. And then whenever you water the crop, whenever water washes over the CRF, it will actually move through that coating and displace a little bit of fertilizer into the water as it moves over it. So that's why it's called controlled release. Uh, the other thing that happens is temperature also impacts how much fertilizer is released. It's typically sold in different lengths of duration. So anywhere from 3 months to 6 months is how long the CRF will last. Actually, you can get 1 month too. That's just the thickness of the coating that goes over the CRF. But typically around the base of the plant, you want to stay away from direct sunlight if you can, because the heat will increase the rate of nutrient release. And of course, every time it rains, the water moves over the CRF and releases nutrients. So it helps feed your crop in a controlled manner. Whereas a prilled fertilizer, it does dissolve fairly quickly. You don't control it as much as a CRF. Commercially, CRFs, the major brand is called Osmocote because it uses osmosis for water to move through that coating. So yeah, when the temperatures are warmer, nutrients are released more quickly, but they need temperature and moisture to release. Yeah, so leaching, if you don't have enough leaching, you might get salts, but usually you keep an eye on your salt levels as a grower, do a couple of pour throughs here and there. If your salt levels are building up, then you would water a couple of times heavily with clear water. You might still leach from the CRF, but you'll be displacing the high salts out of the bottom of the pot. Let's talk about cut mums for a second. A couple of pictures here from cut mum greenhouse. Notice they've got blackout, right? Because they're going to control the photo period. Lots of different types of cut mums. This is another picture showing cut mums being harvested in a greenhouse. So they're done year round, and typically we want a tall plant, right? And either we want just one flower or we want a few flowers at the top. Okay, so I've got here, we got one bud setting, and here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 buds setting. There's this subtle difference here. If we're going with just one flower with the cut mum production, what we do is we disbud, which means the staff go through and they pull lateral buds off the stem. And that does a couple of things, right? They leave the apical bud, but they remove the others, which means all the sugars and nutrients that are being produced from the plant that are moving up will feed the main flower that's left, and you end up with a much, much bigger flower because it's not competing for nutrients with the other bud sites. These are called disbud cut mums. So it's typically a tall stem with a giant flower at the top. These are just a couple of examples of genetic varieties. These are groups of 3 stems. So here we got a green one, and we got your classic yellow mums. Just one, if you look at the stem, there's no flowers, and then there's one flower at the top. So those are disbuds. If you go to what's called a spray, yeah, I know this is a poor image here. It's what I could find. A spray is a tall plant, but it has a few flowers at the top. So you leave some lateral branches. You may disbud a few down below, but you leave a few branches near the top, and you get quite a few flowers. So for one stem, you fill out a bouquet, but the flowers are smaller, right? That's the trade-off. So usually growers grow a combination of disbuds and sprays, depending on what their customers are looking for. And these are some examples. These are groups of 3 stems. And look how many flowers there are just on 3 stems. So sprays have quite a few more flowers, but they are quite a bit smaller in size. So how do we grow such a tall mum, right? It goes back to the blackout that I was pointing out here in this picture. So what the growers do, depending on the time of year, if it's a time of year where they need to prevent it from flowering, so we're looking, remember chrysanthemums flower when it's short days, right? So we may want to use the cloth if we're trying to encourage them to flower, or we may not. So we want to basically what we do is grow the plant and keep suppressing flowers, keep growing it, keep suppressing flowers. So long days. So how do we do long days? We do what's called night interruption, right? We run those light bulbs over the crops in the middle of the night from anywhere from 2 to 4 hours to prevent buds from forming. And once the plant reaches a certain height, in this case about 90 centimeters, then we turn off the midnight interruption and we encourage flowering. And sometimes we even have to pull the blackout cloth depending on the time of year. So if you're trying to flower chrysanthemums in the middle of the summer, then you need blackout because you need to shorten the day, right? And you need that long night. So blackout is really important for producing cut mums in Ontario, where we have long days for over half the year, right? So typically this is the sequence. We maintain a long day or use night interruption to keep the plant vegetative. Once you've received the desired height, we move on to the next stage, right? So also while we're at this stage, we keep the night temperature close to the day temperature. And that also encourages vegetative growth. And while we're doing this, while we're growing the mum taller, we may remove axial branches and buds to shape it. Then we move on to flower induction, right? So start our blackout and get the flowers forming. And we continue to remove axial buds while the plant starts to flower. That's if we're making a disc bud. And for a spray, you may remove some of the lower ones, but typically it's grown tall enough that you just leave, for the most part, leave them all, and you get your spray. As far as pests for chrysanthemums, it's the usual suspects, except maybe leaf miner. It's a favorite of leaf miner. If you ever see these white tracks, that's leaf miner. They are a bit of a pain to control. Your IPM people have taught you some of the beneficials that will go after leaf miner, but they're definitely a problem. This is a parasitic wasp laying an egg in a leaf miner. I think it's diglyphus. It's fairly effective, but you got to use a lot of them. Remember, some of you I talked to about the mullein plant that is used to maintain diglyphus. A lot of mum growers use these flying wasps that will try to control your leaf miner. But when you have leaves that are this unsightly, it's hard to sell your fall mum. You probably have to throw it out. So now these little larvae that hatch and then they crawl between the upper and lower epidermis of the leaf. If you can see where they start, it's small, and as they grow, they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the path gets wider and wider until it's fat. And then they cut a hole and they emerge and they drop down to the ground where they mature in the soil, and then they turn into a flyer that goes and lays eggs again. They are really challenging to control, but it can be done. There's also the hoverfly here, but whatever. It is a pain. They're very destructive. As far as fungal infections, botrytis is a fairly common in mums, especially in the fall when you got a lot of water sitting on your crop. So you got to watch for that. Bacterial leaf spot, you get these dark spots that form randomly on leaves. And remember, they're usually not symmetrical. If it was symmetrical and on both edges, we would think more nutritional, right? But they are usually in blotches. That's your bacterial leaf spot. If you start seeing wilting or curling, now this picture, I guess I should have zoomed, but you can see the leaves kind of had a little bit of a curl at the new growth near the apical meristem. This is a sign that we're not getting enough water up the vasculature to help the new growth expand. And that's usually a sign of either Pythium or Fusarium. Something's in the vasculature stopping water from flowing. And so you get that wilt. So if you look for curling and wilting, then you know you have Pythium or Fusarium. Pythium we know how to diagnose because we would take the plant out of the pot and we would look at the roots, right, and see if they slide off their steel. Uh, this is an extreme example. Obviously, this is beyond salvage. That's when you have let it go too long. So oftentimes drenching with fungicide is a preventative. There's a lot of beneficial fungi like actinovate. We've discussed this in other classes that are effective at preventing fungal infections. But if you have an outdoor fall crop, you're subject to Mother Nature, and you may have a really, really wet fall, and it can prove devastating to your crops. So you're at the mercies of Mother Nature when you grow outside. White rust, which is a controlled disease, if you get it in your crop, the CFIA will remove your crop at your expense. So you need to be really careful you don't get this. And if you do, you got to clean it up right away. They look like white crusty pustules underneath the leaf, and on the top side, it looks like a green gnarly raised crown. It is a serious risk with mums. It's restricted. They're trying to keep it out of our country. I haven't seen it myself, although growers have run into it. So it typically means you got to start with good material. You know, if you keep taking your own cuttings all the time, not so good. You got to buy cuttings from a reputable supplier, a clean certified supplier. You need to keep your plants spaced, let air flow, no touching. Typically, you don't water at the end of the day because you're going to get standing water that lets spores germinate. There's all the usual suspects for preventing a fungal infection. Now, like powdery mildew, it requires a living host. So if you clean properly between crops, there's no reason for that disease to carry over to a new crop. There is the chance that nearby daisies, like wild daisies or marigolds, can host it. They're compatible. So be careful about what's grown around your farm. Viruses, like all plants, chrysanthemums are susceptible. It even has its own very own virus named after it, but this one will also affect other plants. But chrysanthemum mosaic, remember it's a mosaic, so it creates interesting what we call mosaic patterns in the leaf. That's how we identify it as a mosaic. There could be concentric rings, but they're usually patterns of some sort that make the leaf look almost variegated. Another one is impatiens necrotic spot virus. And it really is literally that. You get small, lots of necrotic spots. This could be challenging to identify because you want to look for it not confusing it with nutrient deficiencies. And this is a really good example here because we see it on this side, right? But we don't see it on this side. So again, the symmetry is what helps give us clues as to whether it's a nutrient problem or viral or fungal. So look for that, you know, symmetry, keep saying that. Look for that lack of or symmetry across the center blade of the blade to give you some clues. And then, of course, a tomato spotted wilt virus is another one. This, again, would be difficult. So here's a leaf, right? We're looking at the middle of the leaf, and here's some necrosis on the edge. Do we see it on this side? No. We see it on only one side. So that's going to tell us that we're looking at either a fungal or a viral infection. And remember, the only way we can truly identify a virus is using an antigen test, those AGDIA tests, where you take a leaf, mash it, put it in a tube, drop a stick in, and then you look for a color reaction. And it tells us if it has the virus or not. Here you can see that apically there's green leaves on this, but below it there's yellow leaves, and then there's green leaves again. That's also not typical for a nutrient deficiency. So again, you'd suspect that it's viral. Oh, that brings us to the end of chrysanthemums. It's a quicker lesson, but covered some interesting stuff. We discussed yet another photoperiodic and thermomorphic crop, and we talked about how to grow cut versus potted with disc budding and using photoperiod to control stem length for cuts. So a lot of interesting stuff there. Okay.